Tonight, you're stepping into a world where wood remembers every hand that touched it, and buildings rise slowly, without power tools, without hurry, and very much without mercy for crooked measurements. You arrive at dawn, which in the medieval world is less a poetic concept and more an unavoidable fact of biology. The sun comes up whether you are ready or not, and so do you. There is no snooze button. There is a rooster, and it is extremely confident about its job. You stand on a dirt road that barely deserves the name road, more a long-standing agreement between mud and footsteps. The air smells faintly of damp earth, old smoke, and the quiet optimism of a day that hasn't gone wrong yet. Ahead of you, a half-built timber structure waits patiently. It doesn't loom. Medieval buildings rarely loom at this stage. They squat like animals deciding whether you are worth acknowledging. Wooden posts lie on the ground beside it, some straight, some aspirational. This is where medieval carpenters work, and by extension, where you now work too. Congratulations! You probably won't make it through this day without learning something you didn't know you needed. There are no buzzing saws, no laser levels, no trucks unloading pre-cut beams with suspiciously perfect edges. Instead, there is wood in its natural, stubborn state. Oak mostly because oak lasts and because medieval Europe was very enthusiastic about cutting it down. You can still see bark clinging to some logs, as if the tree hasn't quite accepted its new career as architecture. The carpenter you're shadowing today doesn't introduce himself. Names are less important than hands here, and his hands are remarkable. Thick, scarred, darkened by years of resin and weather, they move with a calm certainty that suggests he has done this thousands of times and would rather not explain it again. He gestures for you to follow, which you do, carefully stepping over a coil of rope that looks innocent but would absolutely trip you if given the chance. This is your first quiet realization. Medieval carpenters don't rush. They can't. Without modern tools, speed is replaced by precision and patience is enforced by physics. Wood doesn't forgive haste. If you cut wrong, that beam doesn't get a second chance. It gets repurposed into something smaller, less important, and slightly resentful. Here is your first major historical fact, delivered gently so it doesn't startle you. Medieval carpenters built most large structures using green wood, meaning freshly cut timber that was still wet and flexible. This wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. Green wood is easier to shape with hand tools, easier to split cleanly, and, most importantly, it shrinks as it dries, tightening joints instead of loosening them. Buildings literally pulled themselves together over time, which is an architectural trick modern IKEA furniture has yet to master. You run your hand along one of the beams and feel shallow grooves carved into its surface. These are not decorative. They are the marks of an adze, a tool that looks like an axe that went through a phase of self-reflection and came out sideways. The adze is used to smooth and shape wood by hand, stroke after careful stroke. Each groove is a decision. Each angle is intentional. Somewhere, centuries later, an archaeologist will look at these marks and think, ah yes, this carpenter preferred a slightly left-handed swing. That is how personal this work is. The carpenter lifts the adze and demonstrates, not for you, but because the wood demands it. The rhythm is steady. Thok, thok, thok. The sound is oddly soothing, like a heartbeat if your heart were made of oak and mild resentment. You realize that this rhythm sets the pace of the day. There is no clock tower nearby counting down productivity. Time is measured in sunlight, muscle fatigue, and how much progress the wood allows. Nearby, another carpenter is using a long saw with a partner. This is a pit saw, one of the least glamorous tools in history. One man stands above the log, one below, often in an actual pit, pulling the saw up and down together. Gravity helps one of them. Misery helps the other. This is teamwork in its purest form. It is also why medieval carpenters tended to develop strong opinions about fairness. Here comes your obscure cultural tidbit, tucked in quietly like a secret. Medieval carpenters were part of guilds that guarded their techniques fiercely. Some joints and measurement tricks were never written down, only taught orally, apprentice to master. This wasn't romantic mysticism, it was job security. If everyone knew how to build a cathedral roof, suddenly you're just another guy with an axe and an opinion. You watch as a wooden joint is prepared. No nails, no metal fasteners. Instead, a mortise and tenon joint is carefully carved, one piece of wood with a rectangular hole, the other with a matching tongue. When fitted together, they lock with a satisfying, quiet certainty. A wooden peg is driven through to secure it. The peg is slightly larger than the hole. This is not an error. This is confidence. As the peg goes in, it squeaks, wood on wood. A sound that says, yes, this will hold. You feel an unexpected sense of trust in the structure, like it would still be standing even if everyone involved wandered off to argue about lunch. And in many cases, it did. Some medieval timber frames are still standing today, long after their builders stopped worrying about them. You pause, leaning against a post that isn't quite upright yet. Remember this post. You'll see it again later, when it matters more than you expect. The carpenter glances at you, finally acknowledging your presence with a look that says, "You haven't broken anything yet." High praise. He gestures toward a measuring rod, just a stick really with notches cut into it. This is how measurements work here. No universal inches. No standardized centimeters. Each workshop has its own measuring system, often based on the master carpenter's body. The length of his foot, the span of his arms, the width of his thumb. Buildings were literally built to fit the people who made them, which is charming until you realize how awkward that gets if the next carpenter is much taller. Historians still debate how much variation these personal measurement systems caused across regions, and whether medieval builders adjusted intuitively or simply accepted that no two buildings would ever quite agree with each other. The morning wears on. The sun climbs. The sounds of work layer together, wood splitting, tools tapping, distant voices. You feel oddly calm. Tired, but calm. This is not the frantic productivity of modern construction. This is slow creation, deliberate and a little stubborn, like the buildings themselves. Before you sink any deeper into this world, a soft reminder drifts in, almost apologetic. If you're enjoying this pace, if your shoulders feel relaxed and your breathing has slowed, you might consider liking and subscribing. It helps this little corner of quiet history exist. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling where you're listening from and what time it is there. Medieval carpenters would have found that information deeply impractical, but politely interesting. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. And without stopping, you follow the carpenter as he moves toward the stacked beams at the edge of the site, where the real tricks, the ones that keep buildings standing for centuries, are waiting. You walk past the stacked beams slowly, because they demand it. They are arranged not randomly, but thoughtfully, each piece lifted and turned so air can move around it. This is seasoning, and it takes months or years. Wood, like people, behaves better when given time. The carpenter runs a hand over one beam, listening with his fingers. He taps it lightly. The sound tells him something you can't quite hear yet. Experience has trained his senses far beyond polite conversation. This is where you start to understand that medieval carpentry is less about brute force and more about negotiation. Wood swells, shrinks, twists, and complains. The carpenter's job is not to dominate it, but to predict its bad moods and plan accordingly. Modern tools try to overpower materials. Medieval tools ask them nicely, then wait. The carpenter kneels and marks a beam with charcoal. No ruler, no tape measure, just careful alignment against another piece of wood and a quiet nod, as if the beam has agreed to the plan. You remember the post you leaned on earlier, the one that wasn't quite upright. This beam will eventually meet it. Not today, but soon. Here comes another important historical fact, placed gently into your path like a stepping stone. Medieval carpenters relied heavily on geometry, not measurements, to ensure accuracy. They used simple shapes, triangles, squares, circles, laid out with string and pegs. A triangle with equal sides doesn't lie. A square drawn carefully with rope will always be square. This meant that even without standardized units, buildings could remain astonishingly precise. You watch as a length of rope is looped and knotted, then stretched between two pegs. The carpenter checks the angles by eye, adjusts slightly, then steps back. It's right. Not good enough. Right. You feel an odd respect for the rope. It has seen things. Nearby, another worker sharpens a chisel on a stone. Slowly, patiently, no sparks, just the quiet scrape of metal meeting rock. Tools are precious here. A poorly sharpened chisel doesn't just make bad work. It wastes energy, time, and wood. And wood, as you are learning, is the main character in this story. You pick up a chisel heavier than expected. The handle is worn smooth from generations of hands. This tool might be older than the building you're standing in, possibly older than the idea of building it. Medieval tools lasted because they had to. There is no overnight shipping for replacements. If something breaks, you fix it or you wait, and waiting is expensive. An apprentice nearby is sweeping up wood shavings. This is not busy work. Shavings are saved for kindling, insulation, even animal bedding. Nothing is wasted. The medieval world does not have the luxury of disposable materials. Everything has a second purpose and sometimes a third, and occasionally a fourth that no one is proud of. Here's your obscure cultural tidbit, slipped in like a secret between friends. Some medieval carpenters believed certain trees were unlucky to build with, especially if they were struck by lightning or grew twisted in unusual ways. Not all of this was superstition. A twisted tree often meant warped grain, which meant structural weakness. But it was easier and more comforting to say the tree was cursed. The carpenter pauses, squinting at the sky. Clouds drift lazily, unconcerned with your project. Weather matters. Rain can swell wood too early. Heat can dry it too fast. The medieval carpenter builds with the seasons in mind, not against them. There is a reason most major construction begins in spring. Winter is for planning, repairing tools, and complaining quietly. You step inside the partial structure. The frame creaks softly, not in protest, but in conversation. Wood speaks. It always has. You place a hand on one of the vertical posts and feel a faint vibration from the activity around you. This post is grounded, anchored into the earth with stone footings beneath it. No concrete, just carefully chosen stones, fitted together so water drains away instead of pooling. Rot is the enemy, and medieval carpenters know it well. Historians still debate how widespread this knowledge was among everyday builders versus elite craftsmen, but the surviving structures suggest a level of environmental awareness that modern builders occasionally rediscover and then immediately ignore again. You notice small symbols carved into some beams, simple marks, not decorative. These are assembly marks, a kind of medieval instruction manual. Roman numerals, lines, shapes. They tell workers which piece goes where when the frame is raised. Because frames are often built on the ground first, then lifted into place in a dramatic, communal effort that involves ropes, shouting, and at least one person standing somewhere unsafe with absolute confidence. That raising will happen later. For now, everything is preparation. A light joke drifts through your mind, uninvited but welcome. If medieval carpenters had a motto, it might be measure twice, cut once, and then stare at it for a while just to be sure. No one laughs, but you feel it's accurate. You follow the carpenter back outside, where sunlight has warmed the air and the smell of fresh-cut wood is stronger now. He shows you a wooden mallet, no metal head. Metal would damage the chisel handles. This is tool etiquette, medieval style. Even tools have rules about how they're treated. As the day moves on, fatigue settles into your shoulders. Not sharply, gently, the kind of tiredness that feels earned. You realize that this work, slow as it is, requires constant attention. One careless moment, one distracted cut, and hours of labor unravel quietly. You glance back at the road you walked in on this morning. It looks different now. Familiar, like you've been here longer than you have. Remember that road. You'll cross it again later when the building begins to rise and you understand why all this patience mattered. For now, you stay where you are, standing among beams and rope and quiet determination, as medieval carpentry continues to reveal itself not as a primitive struggle, but as a careful conversation between human hands and living material. And the day is far from over. By midday, the sun has climbed high enough to make you reconsider every life choice that led you to standing in an open construction site made almost entirely of reflective, heat-loving wood. The medieval carpenter does not complain. Complaining does not make beams lighter. It only makes you thirsty, and thirst is already a known problem. You notice something now that you missed in the morning haze. The silence between sounds. Not silence exactly, more like breathing room. No engines. No alarms. Just the measured punctuation of tools meeting wood, separated by pauses where people think before acting. Medieval carpentry is full of these pauses. They are not inefficiencies. They are safeguards. You're led to a shaded area where several curved pieces of timber rest against a wall. These look wrong at first glance. Bent, warped, like mistakes that were too big to throw away. You assume, briefly, that these will be cut down into something smaller and less ambitious. You are wrong, and the carpenter lets you be wrong for a few seconds longer than necessary. These curved beams are intentional. This is one of the quiet tricks medieval carpenters relied on. They followed the natural shape of the tree instead of forcing it straight. A curved branch used where a curved force is expected, like in a roof brace, can be stronger than a perfectly straight beam. Nature already solved the problem. The carpenter simply noticed. This is your major historical fact for this section, and it lands softly but firmly. Medieval builders often used crooked timber for structural advantage, especially in roof trusses. Modern builders cut around curves. Medieval builders designed with them. It's efficient, elegant, and mildly insulting to anyone who believes progress is always linear. You trace the curve of one beam with your eyes and imagine the tree it once was, growing slowly, leaning toward light, resisting wind. That resistance is still here, embedded in the grain. The carpenter doesn't explain this to you. He just points where it will go and nods, as if the beam has been waiting for this role its entire life. Nearby, an apprentice struggles with a draw knife, shaving long curls of wood from a beam. The curls fall to the ground like wooden ribbons, piling up around his feet. He is sweating. He is concentrating very hard. He is learning the ancient lesson that would punish his impatience immediately and publicly. The drawknife itself is simple, two handles, a blade in between. You pull it toward you, not push. This feels counterintuitive at first, like trying to convince gravity to take a day off. But once it clicks, it clicks. The blade bites just enough, peels just enough, and suddenly the beam is smoother, cleaner, calmer. You feel a small, quiet pride. The carpenter pretends not to notice. He notices. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, slipped in like a whispered aside. In some regions, carpenters were believed to leave a small, deliberate flaw in a building to avoid divine jealousy. A perfectly made structure might attract unwanted attention from forces that dislike human pride. Whether this belief was widespread or just a convenient excuse for imperfections is flexible. Historians still debate how much medieval craftsmanship was influenced by spiritual symbolism versus practical necessity, and whether later generations romanticized intentions that were, at the time, simply good problem-solving. You take a break because everyone does eventually. Lunch is simple. Bread, cheese, something pickled, water that tastes faintly of whatever container it lived in previously. People sit on beams, stones, the ground. There is no designated break room. The entire world is the break room. Conversation drifts. Not loudly. Stories about other builds, other towns. A roof that collapsed because someone rushed the joints. A hall that stood for decades because the builder waited an extra season before raising the frame. These stories are warnings disguised as entertainment. Medieval carpenters learn as much from failure as from success, preferably someone else's. You glance back at the structure. It still looks incomplete, skeletal, like a thought not yet finished. But now you see the logic, the curves, the angles, the quiet intelligence in how each piece anticipates stress, weight, time. Remember the rope geometry from earlier? You see it echoed here in wood, frozen into place. A light, dry thought passes through your mind. Modern buildings often come with instruction manuals thicker than medieval Bibles and still end up leaking. No one says it out loud, but you feel it. As the sun begins its slow descent, work resumes, not frantically, but with renewed focus. This is when careful fitting happens. When mistakes are least forgivable because energy is low and shadows are long. The carpenter checks joints again, and again, and one more time just to be irritatingly thorough. You touch the post you leaned on this morning. Steadier now, not finished, but more certain, like it knows where it belongs. The day has changed you slightly. You are tired in a way that feels old and familiar, as if your body remembers this rhythm from somewhere deep and inconveniently ancestral. And the building, though still unfinished, is beginning to remember itself too. Evening approaches, and with it comes a subtle shift in how everyone moves. The pace slows, not because the work is done, but because the light is fading, and light is not something you waste or argue with in the medieval world. Shadows stretch across the site, long and angled, pointing at things you didn't notice before. This is when you see the joints up close. The carpenter beckons you over to a corner where two massive beams meet at an angle that looks improbable but somehow inevitable. He crouches, gestures, and lets you examine it. There are no nails here, no brackets, just wood shaped to fit wood, locked together with pegs that have swollen slightly in the day's heat. This is the quiet genius of medieval joinery. Friction and geometry do the work, not metal. Nails existed, of course, but they were expensive and prone to rust. Wood-on-wood joints, when done properly, lasted longer and flexed with the building instead of fighting it. The structure could move slightly with wind, temperature, and time without tearing itself apart. Flexibility, it turns out, is not a modern invention. You press gently against the joint. Nothing moves. Feels calm. solid in a way that doesn't need to prove itself. Here's your major historical fact for this section. Medieval carpenters often tested joints by sound. A properly seated joint made a dull, satisfied thud when struck. A bad one rang too sharply. Buildings were tuned, not just assembled. If this feels strange, remember that instruments were built the same way. The ear was a trusted diagnostic tool. The carpenter taps the joint lightly with his mallet. Thud. He nods. Approval granted. You notice small wedges driven into gaps, nearly invisible unless you're looking for them. These wedges allow for future adjustment. As wood dries and shifts, wedges can be tightened. Maintenance is built into the design. This building expects to be cared for. It is not pretending to be eternal. An apprentice nearby is carving pegs, dozens of them. Each peg is slightly tapered, thicker at one end. This is deliberate. When driven in, the peg locks tighter the deeper it goes. Removing it later is possible but annoying, which is exactly the point. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit. In some guild traditions, apprentices weren't allowed to carve pegs for important joints until years into training. Pegs looked simple, but a poorly made one could doom an entire frame. Trust was earned one taper at a time. Historians still debate how standardized these training practices were across regions, and how much skill variation existed between rural builders and those working on grand urban projects. The air cools. Tools are cleaned, not meticulously but respectfully. Blades are wiped. Handles checked. Tools are leaned carefully against walls or wrapped in cloth. You don't just toss a chisel aside. Tools remember neglect. Someone lights a small fire nearby. Not for work now, but for warmth and light. The flames flicker against the unfinished frame, casting moving shadows that make the structure look alive, stretching and breathing as the day ends. You sit on a beam, legs dangling, watching the carpenter walk the site one last time. He touches posts, presses joints, listens. This is not inspection. This is conversation. The building answers quietly, in the language of resistance and balance. A soft, ironic thought floats through your tired mind. Medieval carpenters built structures meant to last centuries, while modern buildings sometimes struggle to outlive their warranty period. Again, no one says it out loud, but it feels true enough to rest on. The road you arrived on this morning is dim now, barely visible. Tomorrow, more work, more fitting. Eventually, the dramatic raising of the frame. But tonight, the structure rests, held together by gravity, geometry, and the accumulated patience of human hands. You realize that nothing here feels rushed. Not the work, not the learning, not even the exhaustion. It's the kind of tired that invites sleep instead of fighting it. As the last light fades and tools fall silent, you stand once more inside the wooden skeleton of a building that trusts its builders, and the trees that became it. And you understand now that medieval carpentry wasn't about building faster or cheaper. It was about building in a way that time itself would respect. Morning returns without ceremony. No trumpet, no announcement. Just light sliding quietly across the ground, revealing yesterday's work exactly as you left it, patient, unfinished, and waiting for you to catch up. The building does not judge. It has all the time in the world. You, on the other hand, stretch in a way that suggests your body is filing a formal complaint. You step back onto the site, and the smell hits you first. Wood warmed by early sun, damp soil, faint smoke from someone reheating yesterday's fire. The structure looks taller today, though you know it hasn't changed overnight. This is your perception adjusting. Yesterday you saw pieces. Today you're beginning to see intention. The carpenter is already here. Of course he is. Medieval mornings belong to people who accept discomfort as a default setting. He motions you toward a cluster of beams laid out carefully on the ground. This, you sense, is important. These are not just any beams. These are the ones that will soon leave the earth. Today is about preparation for the frame raising, one of the most communal and quietly nerve-wracking events in medieval construction. Nothing is lifted until everything is ready. There are no do-overs once gravity joins the conversation. Here is your major historical fact for this section. Introduced gently so it doesn't interrupt your breathing. Medieval timber frames were often fully assembled on the ground first, joints fitted and tested, before being dismantled and raised into place. This ensured that when the structure went up, it did so with minimal surprises. Medieval carpenters distrusted improvisation at heights. Sensible people always have. You watch as chalk marks are refreshed, pegs counted, joints checked again. And then, because the universe enjoys irony, checked one more time. The carpenter presses a joint with his thumb, frowns slightly, and hands it back to an apprentice. It needs a whisper more adjustment. Not a fix, a whisper. You remember the rope geometry from earlier. It's back. Strings are stretched, angles verified. The rope remembers what straight is, even when humans forget. Remember the post you leaned on yesterday? It's been shaved, adjusted, and now fits its mate with a soft, approving knock. The building is beginning to recognize itself. There's a strange energy in the air. Not excitement exactly. Focus. People speak less. Movements become economical. Someone trips, swears quietly, and everyone pretends not to notice because acknowledging it would invite worse. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, slipped in like a superstition no one fully admits to believing. In some regions, carpenters avoided raising frames on certain days thought to be unlucky. Tuesday was a favorite suspect. So was any day associated with recent bad weather, strange dreams, or someone mentioning collapse out loud. Rational? Not entirely. Human? Completely. Historians still debate how much superstition actually influenced scheduling versus how much was simply post hoc justification for delays caused by weather, fatigue, or common sense. Ropes are laid out. Thick, worn, trusted. These ropes have lifted more than wood. They've lifted reputations. A failed frame raising doesn't just damage timber, it damages trust. Guilds remember these things. You're assigned a simple task. Hold tension. Not too much. Not too little. Just enough to keep things honest. Sounds easy. It isn't. Your arms begin to ache almost immediately, and you gain a deep personal respect for medieval shoulders. The signal comes subtle, not shouted. The frame begins to rise. Slowly, painfully slowly. Wood creaks. Ropes tighten. Feet dig into dirt. Someone breathes too loudly and is quietly resented. The frame reaches a point where it could still fall back, where doubt lives. Then it passes that point and gravity changes sides. It stands. Not finished. Not secure yet. But upright. A collective exhale ripples through the group. Understated but profound. No cheering. No celebration. Just relief. The building is no longer a thought. It is a presence. A dry, sleepy thought crosses your mind. Modern construction cranes do this kind of thing while playing pop music on the radio, and yet somehow this feels more advanced. The carpenter steps back, eyes narrowed, listening. The structure settles into itself with a series of quiet, almost conversational sounds. Nothing alarming, nothing sharp. This is good. You step back too, arms trembling, heart steady. You helped raise something that expects to outlive you, that does something to your sense of scale. As the day winds on, braces are added, wedges tightened, pegs driven home. The frame is stabilized. The risk has passed for now. You look at the road again, the one you arrived on. It feels further away, as if the building has pulled you into its timeline, where days stretch and patience accumulates interest. The sun begins its descent, and you feel the familiar, earned exhaustion settling in. The kind that doesn't ask questions. And you realize something quietly important. Medieval carpenters didn't just build structures. They built moments where communities held their breath together, and then learned to breathe again. Night leaves slowly, like a guest who doesn't want to interrupt the conversation. When morning finally takes over, the frame still stands. This feels like a small miracle, though everyone pretends it was inevitable. The carpenter nods once at the structure, the way one nods at a stubborn animal that has finally agreed to cooperate. Today's work is less dramatic but no less important. Now that the skeleton is upright, the real long-term thinking begins. This is where medieval carpenters prove they weren't just strong but clever. You're drawn to the roof timbers laid out nearby. Long, angled, and intimidating. Roofs are everything. They protect the structure, define its shape, and fail very publicly if done wrong. The carpenter approaches them with visible respect. Here is your major historical fact for this section, placed carefully so it doesn't jolt you awake. Medieval carpenters designed roofs to shed weight as much as water. Snow, rain, and wind were constant threats. Roof pitches were steep not for style but survival. A roof that lingered under snow did not last long enough to become nostalgic. The beams are tested again. Curved timbers are matched with straight ones, not randomly, but in a choreography that feels almost musical. Remember those naturally curved beams from earlier? This is where they shine. They brace, resist, and distribute force without complaint. You help lift one end of a rafter. It is heavier than expected. Everything is heavier than expected. There is no illusion of ease here, but there is efficiency. Each movement has been considered before it happens. The carpenter shows you a joint that allows slight movement, just enough to absorb wind without cracking. This is flexibility engineered into permanence. It feels almost philosophical. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, slipped in like a superstition no one fully admits to believing. In some regions, carpenters avoided raising frames on certain days thought to be unlucky. Tuesday was a favorite suspect. So was any day associated with recent bad weather, strange dreams, or someone mentioning collapse out loud. Rational? Not entirely. Human? Completely. Historians still debate how much superstition actually influenced scheduling versus how much was simply post hoc justification for delays caused by weather, fatigue, or common sense. Ropes are laid out. Thick, worn, trusted. These ropes have lifted more than wood. They've lifted reputations. A failed frame raising doesn't just damage timber, it damages trust. Guilds remember these things. You're assigned a simple task. Hold tension. Not too much. Not too little. Just enough to keep things honest. Sounds easy. It isn't. Your arms begin to ache almost immediately, and you gain a deep personal respect for medieval shoulders. The signal comes subtle, not shouted. The frame begins to rise. Slowly, painfully slowly. Wood creaks. Ropes tighten. Feet dig into dirt. Someone breathes too loudly and is quietly resented. The frame reaches a point where it could still fall back, where doubt lives. Then it passes that point and gravity changes sides. It stands. Not finished. Not secure yet. But upright. A collective exhale ripples through the group. Understated but profound. No cheering. No celebration. Just relief. The building is no longer a thought. It is a presence. A dry, sleepy thought crosses your mind. Modern construction cranes do this kind of thing while playing pop music on the radio, and yet somehow this feels more advanced. The carpenter steps back, eyes narrowed, listening. The structure settles into itself with a series of quiet, almost conversational sounds. Nothing alarming, nothing sharp. This is good. You step back too, arms trembling, heart steady. You helped raise something that expects to outlive you, that does something to your sense of scale. As the day winds on, braces are added, wedges tightened, pegs driven home. The frame is stabilized. The risk has passed for now. You look at the road again, the one you arrived on. It feels further away, as if the building has pulled you into its timeline, where days stretch and patience accumulates interest. The sun begins its descent, and you feel the familiar, earned exhaustion settling in. The kind that doesn't ask questions. And you realize something quietly important. Medieval carpenters didn't just build structures. They built moments where communities held their breath together, and then learned to breathe again. Night leaves slowly, like a guest who doesn't want to interrupt the conversation. When morning finally takes over, the frame still stands. This feels like a small miracle, though everyone pretends it was inevitable. The carpenter nods once at the structure, the way one nods at a stubborn animal that has finally agreed to cooperate. Today's work is less dramatic but no less important. Now that the skeleton is upright, the real long-term thinking begins. This is where medieval carpenters prove they weren't just strong but clever. You're drawn to the roof timbers laid out nearby. Long, angled, and intimidating. Roofs are everything. They protect the structure, define its shape, and fail very publicly if done wrong. The carpenter approaches them with visible respect. Here is your major historical fact for this section, placed carefully so it doesn't jolt you awake. Medieval carpenters designed roofs to shed weight as much as water. Snow, rain, and wind were constant threats. Roof pitches were steep not for style but survival. A roof that lingered under snow did not last long enough to become nostalgic. The beams are tested again. Curved timbers are matched with straight ones, not randomly, but in a choreography that feels almost musical. Remember those naturally curved beams from earlier? This is where they shine. They brace, resist, and distribute force without complaint. You help lift one end of a rafter. It is heavier than expected. Everything is heavier than expected. There is no illusion of ease here, but there is efficiency. Each movement has been considered before it happens. The carpenter shows you a joint that allows slight movement, just enough to absorb wind without cracking. This is flexibility engineered into permanence. It feels almost philosophical. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, resting lightly on the scene. Some medieval builders believed roofs were the crowns of buildings and treated their completion as symbolically significant. In certain towns, the final roof beam was decorated with greenery or ribbons before being set, a quiet celebration of survival rather than ambition. Historians still debate how widespread these customs were, and how often practicality outweighed symbolism when time or money ran short, which was often. As rafters go up, the building's voice changes. It no longer echoes as much. Sound is caught, softened. You clap once, experimentally. The sound is duller now, contained. The structure is learning to be indoors. You notice small gaps deliberately left between certain elements. Not mistakes. Allowances. Wood will swell. It always does. Medieval carpenters expect this. They plan for it. Modern builders sometimes act surprised, as if nature betrayed them personally. A quiet, ironic thought slips in. The medieval world had fewer tools, fewer materials, fewer guarantees, and yet seemed far more emotionally prepared for things to move unexpectedly. By late afternoon, shadows stretch again. The roof is not finished, but its promise is visible. The frame feels less like scaffolding and more like shelter. The carpenter wipes his hands on his apron and surveys the work, satisfied in a way that does not require smiling. You stand beneath the rising roof and feel the space change around you. Enclosed, purposeful. The air smells different here, less open, more intimate, like a place where stories might happen. Your body is tired. Your mind is calm. The rhythm of the work has slowed your thoughts into something pleasantly vague. You remember the first beam you touched, the rope, the post, the road. They are all still here, threaded through the building like memories. As the light fades and tools are set aside, you realize the structure is no longer just being built. It is settling into the world. And so are you. By now, the building knows your footsteps. You notice it the moment you arrive, how the ground feels firmer where people have walked for days, how the air inside the frame seems to pause when you enter, as if it's listening. Morning light slides through the unfinished roof in long, pale ribbons, catching dust that drifts lazily like it has nowhere urgent to be. You stand there for a moment longer than necessary, because no one rushes you. The medieval workday begins when bodies arrive, not when clocks demand obedience. Today is about walls, but not walls the way you imagine them. Not solid barriers meant to shut the world out. These walls are compromises, agreements between weather, gravity, materials, and human patience. The carpenter leads you to a stack of woven panels leaning against a fence. They look fragile, alarmingly so. Thin strips of wood interlaced into something that resembles an unfinished basket. You blink at them, then at the towering frame behind you. These are the walls. Here is your major historical fact for this section, eased in gently like a reassuring hand on the shoulder. Many medieval buildings, especially in towns, used wattle and daub for walls. Wattle was a lattice of wooden strips. Daub was a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and whatever else happened to be nearby and sticky. Together, they formed walls that were flexible, insulating, and surprisingly durable when cared for. You help lift one of the wattle panels. It weighs almost nothing compared to the beams you've been wrestling all week. This feels like a trick, like the building is suddenly playing a joke on you. The panel slots neatly between posts. No nails, no fasteners, just pressure, fit, and trust. The carpenter taps it once, listens, then nods. Approval granted. Daub comes next. It is exactly what you expect. Cold, gritty, unpleasant to touch, and impossible to keep off your clothes. Someone hands you a lump and you hesitate. There is no elegant way to do this. You press it into the lattice with your palms, and it squishes obediently through the gaps, clinging to the wood like it wants to be there. The smell is earthy, honest, slightly offensive. This, you realize, is what medieval homes smelled like before flowers, herbs, or social expectations intervened. A light, dry joke drifts through your thoughts. Modern walls hide their contents behind paint and drywall. Medieval walls proudly announced every ingredient, including the cow. The process is rhythmic. Press. Smooth. Step back. Press again. The wall grows slowly, layer by layer. It doesn't harden immediately. It needs time. Everything here needs time. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, tucked into the work like a superstition no one laughs at. In some regions, people believed daub walls had to be mixed by hand to know the house. Using tools too much was thought to make walls less loyal. Whether this belief was spiritual or simply a way to ensure thorough mixing is, conveniently, unclear. Historians still debate how much of medieval building tradition was shaped by belief versus practicality. especially when both produced identical results. As the walls rise, sound changes again. The building grows quieter, more private. Outside noises dull into suggestions. Inside, your breath feels louder. You can imagine voices echoing here someday. Laughter bouncing off surfaces that are still wet beneath your hands. You catch yourself smoothing the wall more carefully than necessary. This will be someone's shelter, someone's winters, someone's arguments. That thought settles into you, heavy but calm. By afternoon, the walls stand soft and mottled, drying slowly. They look vulnerable, but the carpenter seems unconcerned. He knows they will harden into something tougher than they appear. You step back into the sunlight, blinking. The building behind you feels less skeletal now, less exposed, more human, and you realize medieval carpenters weren't just enclosing space. They were teaching buildings how to breathe. Rain arrives without warning, as it often does when you are very pleased with yesterday's progress. You wake to it tapping softly against wood, then harder, then with a kind of enthusiastic persistence that suggests it plans to stay a while. The sight smells different in rain, richer, darker, as if the earth itself has leaned closer to watch. The walls hold. The roof, incomplete as it is, sheds water at angles that feel intentional. You find yourself quietly rooting for it, like it's a friend taking a difficult exam. Today's lesson is subtle and easily missed. Protection without ceiling. Medieval carpenters do not aim to make buildings airtight. That would be foolish. Instead, they aim to make them resilient. Here is your major historical fact for this section, placed gently beneath the sound of rain. Medieval structures were designed to manage moisture, not eliminate it. Buildings needed to dry, to flex, to let dampness escape slowly rather than trapping it inside where rot could flourish unseen. The carpenter inspects joints, running his fingers along seams where wood meets wood. Rain darkens the grain, making every line visible. You see how water travels, how it avoids certain paths and favors others. The building is already negotiating with the weather. You are shown small gaps beneath eaves, tiny channels carved where beams meet walls. These are not mistakes. They are exits, places where water is politely encouraged to leave. You think of modern buildings, sealed tight, desperate for perfection, and feel a small, sleepy superiority on behalf of the past. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, slipping in like a folk saying. Some medieval builders believed rain during construction was a good omen, testing the house early while fixes were still easy. A dry build followed by a wet first winter was considered far worse. Historians still debate whether this belief was symbolic comfort or the product of long, soggy experience. The rain slows, mist rises, steam curls faintly from damp wood as the day warms. You help adjust shutters, temporary ones, meant to guard openings while the building finds its rhythm. Hinges are simple. Movements are heavy but dependable. Inside, the air is cool and quiet. The walls have begun to stiffen. You press one experimentally. It resists politely but firmly. A small, ironic thought passes through. Medieval homes were never finished in the modern sense. They were always becoming, always adjusting. Perhaps that made living in them easier to accept. The carpenter speaks quietly about maintenance, not repairs, maintenance. How walls need redaubing, roofs need watching, joints need listening to. Buildings here are relationships, not products. By late afternoon, the rain has passed completely. Sunlight returns, brighter for the interruption. Drops fall from beams in slow, deliberate rhythms. The building seems refreshed. You stand in the doorway, still just an opening, and look out at the road. Remember how far it felt earlier? Now it seems closer again. Familiar. The structure behind you holds its shape, patient and adaptable. It has survived wind, rain, and human hands. Not by resisting change, but by allowing it. And as the day winds down, you feel the same lessons settling gently into you. Flexibility lasts longer than force. The day begins with sound before sight. A hollow thok, a softer knock. Wood speaking to wood in a language that carries farther than voices ever could. You follow it instinctively, like an animal drawn to water, and find the carpenter already at work, testing joints that have rested overnight. He doesn't look at you when you arrive. He listens instead. This, you learn, is inspection. Not the modern kind, with checklists and bright vests and the unshakable confidence of paperwork. This is inspection by ear, by hand, by memory. The carpenter taps a peg lightly, then again. One sound pleases him, another does not. Here is your major historical fact for this section. Set down gently so it doesn't echo too loudly. Medieval carpenters relied heavily on auditory and tactile feedback to assess structures. The sound a beam made when struck, or the way it vibrated under pressure, could reveal weaknesses invisible to the eye. You're invited to try. You tap a joint. Sounds fine. Probably. The carpenter taps the same joint and frowns. He adjusts a peg by a fraction so small you'd miss it if you blinked, and taps again. The sound changes. Deeper. Calmer. The carpenter nods. You pretend you heard the difference. This is the kind of skill that does not survive instruction manuals. It lives only in bodies, passed from hand to hand, ear to ear. Apprentices learn by standing too close and watching everything. The building is quiet otherwise. Walls dry slowly. The roof waits patiently for its final layers. Today is about refinement. Those small adjustments that decide whether a structure ages gracefully or complains loudly for the rest of its life. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, drifting in like a half-remembered saying. Some medieval guilds believed a building carried the mood of its maker. A rushed carpenter produced restless houses. A calm one produced peaceful rooms. Whether this belief was metaphorical wisdom or just an early warning against cutting corners is, predictably, uncertain. Historians still debate how formalized these ideas were, especially given how rarely medieval builders wrote down their feelings about buildings. You spend the morning shaving pegs. Not making them, shaving them. Each peg must taper just so, thick enough to hold, thin enough to enter willingly. You ruin several. No one scolds you. Ruined pegs are expected. Ruined beams are not. The rhythm of the work slows your thoughts again. Shave. Test. Shave. The smell of fresh wood curls around you, sharp and comforting. Time stretches. Hunger arrives politely, then waits. At midday, someone eats near the structure, leaning against a post that feels sturdier than it did yesterday. The building accepts the weight without complaint. This feels like a small victory. You remember the wattle walls, still drying. You remember the rain, the frame raising, the rope. All of it feels present, layered into the structure like memories into a mind. By afternoon, the carpenter is satisfied. Not thrilled. Not celebratory. Satisfied. This, you sense, is the highest compliment available. As the sun lowers, the building sounds different again. Quieter. More settled. Like a person who has finally found a comfortable chair. You leave the site with sawdust on your clothes and a strange calm in your chest, realizing that medieval carpenters didn't just build for strength. They built for silence. Today brings fire. Not the alarming kind, the useful kind. The kind that medieval life quietly orbits around. You smell it before you see it. A thin, smoky sweetness that settles into your clothes and refuses to leave, no matter how many centuries pass. The carpenter leads you to a sheltered corner near the structure, where a small fire crackles low and steady. Clay pots warm nearby. Something dark simmers slowly, stirred with care. This is not lunch. This is treatment. Here is your major historical fact for this section, introduced like a secret shared by the flames. Medieval carpenters often used heat, smoke, and natural substances, like pitch, tar, oils, or lime, to protect wood from insects, moisture, and rot. Preservation was proactive, not reactive. You watch as a beam end is gently warmed, not burned. The carpenter brushes on a dark, sticky mixture that smells sharp and ancient. The wood drinks it in. The surface darkens, richer now, armored in a way that feels almost ceremonial. You help turn pieces, careful not to scorch them. Fire here is not dramatic. It is patient, controlled. It asks for respect and gives durability in return. A soft, ironic thought floats through your mind. Modern treatments come with warning labels and disposal instructions. Medieval ones came with generations of trial, error, and quiet funerals no one wrote about. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, glowing faintly in the smoke. In some regions, builders believed smoke carried protective qualities beyond the physical, that it confused spirits, discouraged ill fortune, and made wood less inviting to unseen guests. Whether this belief was spiritual or simply a reflection of smoke's effectiveness against insects is, as always, unresolved. Historians still debate how builders understood cause and effect when ritual and function overlapped so seamlessly. The treated beams are set aside to cool. They look older now, wiser, as if they've already lived a little. Inside the structure, the air smells faintly of smoke and clay. It's comforting in a way modern sterility rarely achieves. You imagine winters here, fires burning, walls breathing, roofs shedding snow with practiced ease. You notice small details added today. Thresholds smoothed where feet will pass most often. Corners softened so they don't catch clothing or skin. These are kindnesses built into the structure. No one will comment on them. Everyone will feel them. As evening approaches, the fire is allowed to die down naturally. No rushing. No abrupt endings. The carpenter watches the last embers fade, then turns away. The building stands behind you, darker at the joints now, better prepared for time. It has been warmed, sealed, listened to, and trusted. You walk away slowly, aware that every step echoes less than it used to. The structure is learning how to endure, and you, quietly, are learning how to slow down with it. You notice the change before anyone mentions it. The building has stopped feeling temporary. It's subtle, almost rude of it, really. One day it was clearly in progress, patiently unfinished, forgiving of mistakes. And now it stands there with a quiet confidence, as if to say, yes, I will be here a while. The carpenter approaches it the way one approaches an old acquaintance. Not formally, but with respect earned through shared effort. Today is about edges, transitions, the places where one thing becomes another. Doorways are marked out, not with measurements shouted across space, but with chalk lines drawn slowly, thoughtfully. A doorway is not just a hole in a wall. It is a promise of entry, of exit, of warmth and wind and footsteps passing through. Here is your major historical fact for this section, placed carefully like a threshold stone. Medieval carpenters often reinforced doors and openings with extra bracing and denser timber, knowing these points would bear the most stress over time, structurally and socially. You help hold a lintel in place while it's tested. It's heavier than it looks. Everything still is. The carpenter adjusts it until the pressure distributes evenly into the posts. No cracking, no complaint. The doorway accepts its future. Windows come next, smaller than you expect. Narrow, thoughtful. Glass is rare, expensive, and imperfect. Many openings will remain shuttered instead. Wooden panels that open and close with the weather, the hour, the mood of the household. A light, sleepy joke drifts through your mind. Medieval privacy was less about seeing and more about pretending not to hear. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, sliding in like a superstition spoken under the breath. In some regions, builders avoided aligning doors directly with one another, believing it invited drafts, or worse, bad luck, to pass straight through the house. Whether this belief was mystical or simply practical ventilation control remains delightfully unclear. Historians still debate how often symbolic beliefs conveniently reinforced good building science, especially when neither side felt the need to argue. The carpenter shows you how hinges are set. Not perfectly straight, but with a barely perceptible tilt so doors swing closed on their own. Gravity is invited to help. No fighting nature, just cooperation. You test one. It moves slowly, confidently, like it knows what it's for. Inside, the building feels divided now. Spaces suggest themselves. This could be where people sleep. That corner might hold a table. The imagination fills in what carpentry leaves open. By afternoon, your hands ache in that familiar, earned way. You rub them absently against your clothes, leaving pale streaks of chalk and dust. The structure absorbs your presence without comment. As the light fades, you stand in a doorway you helped shape and look outward. The road is there again. It always is. But now it feels like a visitor, not a necessity. The building has learned where it begins and ends. And so, quietly have you. The day smells like finishing, not completion. Finishing is slower, gentler, more deceptive. It's the stage where work looks done long before it actually is. The carpenter knows this. You are learning. Today's focus is surfaces. The parts people touch without thinking. The places hands will rest, lean, slide. These are the details that decide whether a building feels welcoming or merely impressive. Here is your major historical fact for this section. Settled gently into the grain of the story. Medieval carpenters often planed and smoothed only select areas, prioritizing touch points over appearance. Not every surface needed to be beautiful, only the ones people lived against. You run your hand along a beam that has been shaved smooth where shoulders might brush past it. Above, the same beam remains rough, unapologetic. Beauty here is not wasted on the unseen. The carpenter shows you how to read where before it happens, predicting where feet will step most often, where hands will reach instinctively. These places are softened in advance. Kindness, again, built in quietly. A small, ironic thought floats through you. Modern design calls this user experience and charges extra for it. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, almost whispered. In some medieval towns, builders left a single deliberate imperfection. A rough patch, a slightly uneven line, believing only the divine could create perfection. Whether this belief was spiritual humility or a convenient excuse is something no one ever wrote down. Historians still debate how intentional such flaws were, especially given the very human limits of time, tools, and tired hands. You help apply a thin wash to certain wooden surfaces, lime-based, pale, reflective. It brightens the interior without sealing it shut. Light softens. Shadows retreat politely. The building feels warmer now. Not in temperature, but in temperament. You step back and listen. The structure no longer creaks anxiously when the wind moves outside. It responds calmly, like someone who has learned themselves well enough not to panic. As afternoon drifts into evening, work slows naturally. No one announces it. Tools are cleaned. Fires are banked. The carpenter surveys the space one last time today, eyes tracing lines only he fully understands. You stand where the center of the room will be, imagining voices, silence, seasons passing. The building does not rush you. When you finally step outside, the air feels cooler, sharper. The structure behind you holds the day's warmth inside, already practicing its purpose. You realize something with a calm certainty. Medieval carpenters built not for admiration, but for inhabitation. And the building, at last, is ready to be lived in. By now, the building no longer feels like a project. It feels like a presence. You notice it as you approach, how it sits in the landscape without demanding attention, how the ground around it has settled into familiarity. Footpaths have appeared where none were planned. The earth remembers repetition better than people do. Today is quieter. No heavy lifting. No dramatic moments where everyone holds their breath. This is the phase medieval carpenters understood deeply, when a structure stops needing strength and starts needing restraint. Here is your major historical fact for this section, placed gently into the calm. Medieval carpenters often intentionally stopped short of perfect alignment, allowing buildings to adjust naturally over time as wood dried, shifted, and responded to seasons. Rigidity was the enemy of longevity. You walk inside and feel it immediately. The building flexes almost imperceptibly beneath your weight. Not dangerously, just enough to remind you that it's alive in the way wooden things always are. The carpenter presses a hand to a post, not to check it, but to acknowledge it. Minor adjustments happen today. Peg tightened here, a brace loosened there. These decisions are not reactions, they're anticipations. The carpenter is thinking about winters you will never see, storms not yet imagined. A soft, dry thought floats in modern buildings fight time with warranties. Medieval ones negotiated with it. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, settling like dust in a sunbeam. In some regions, builders believed houses needed a period of listening, a pause after construction where no major changes were made, allowing the structure to reveal where it wanted attention. Whether this was spiritual patience or simply smart observation is, as always, unclear. Historians still debate how often these pauses were respected, especially when eager occupants were already waiting to move in. You spend time simply walking the space, feeling where light gathers, where shadows linger, where sound travels and where it disappears. You clap once. The echo is soft now, domestic, forgiving. Outside, the carpenter checks drainage, how rain will move away from the structure, how the ground slopes just enough to prevent pooling. This is not glamorous work. It never will be. But it determines whether the building survives quietly or rots dramatically. By afternoon, there is very little to do. This unsettles you more than hard labor ever did. You look for tasks. The carpenter notices and shakes his head gently. Sometimes the trick is knowing when to stop. You sit on a low beam and let the building exist around you. The smells are familiar now. Wood, lime, earth, faint smoke. They feel permanent in a way nothing ever truly is. As the day ends, the structure stands complete enough to begin its real work, holding lives, not tools. And you understand something medieval carpenters rarely said aloud. A good building does not announce itself. It simply waits. People arrive. Not all at once. Not ceremoniously. Just one by one. Curious, cautious, respectful. The building draws them the way shelter always does. You step aside instinctively, as if making room for something that has earned the center. This is not a grand opening. Medieval life rarely is. It's a gradual claiming, feet crossing thresholds, hands touching walls, voices testing the space. The structure listens, absorbs, adjusts. Here is your major historical fact for this section, offered softly as the room fills. Medieval buildings were often finished by their occupants over time, not their builders. Shelves added, walls reworked, beams repurposed. Construction did not end, it transitioned. You watch someone place a bench against a wall you helped smooth. Another person sets down a bundle of belongings near a post you held steady days ago. The building accepts these additions without protest. A gentle, ironic thought passes through you. Medieval homes were customizable in the truest sense. No manuals required, no customer support line to call when something didn't fit. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, woven into the moment. In some communities, the first fire lit inside a new building was treated with quiet care. Too big was reckless. Too small was insulting. The fire needed to feel welcome. Whether this was ritual or just common sense survives only in fragments. Historians still debate how formal these practices were, especially since most of what we know comes from later accounts, not the builders themselves. The fire burns low and steady. Smoke rises, finds its way out as intended. The roof does its job. The walls hold warmth gently, not greedily. You stand near your doorway, and watch the light shift across the interior. Feels slower here. Time always does indoors. The carpenter observes from a distance, hands folded, face unreadable. This is the part he rarely witnesses. Once people arrive, buildings stop belonging to their makers. You feel a strange mix of pride and detachment. The structure no longer needs you. That is the point. As evening settles in, voices soften. Movements slow. The building hums quietly, not with sound, but with purpose. You step outside and look back once more. The structure holds light inside now, spilling it softly through openings and cracks. It looks inhabited, complete in the only way that matters. And as you walk away, the road welcoming you back like an old habit, you realize the greatest trick medieval carpenters ever mastered wasn't building without modern tools. It was knowing when to disappear. You return later than usual. Not because you're needed, but because you're curious. The building has been occupied now, properly and unmistakably, and you want to see what that has changed. Medieval carpenters rarely speak about this phase, but they always notice it. From a distance, the structure looks calmer, less alert, like someone who has finally exhaled after holding their breath for days. Smoke drifts lazily from an opening near the roofline. Not urgent, not dramatic, just present. Inside, the air is warmer, softer. Sounds are padded by cloth, baskets, bodies. The building has learned new textures. You walk slowly, deliberately, because it feels right to do so. Here is your major historical fact for this section, folded gently into the quiet. Medieval carpenters often returned to buildings months, or even years, after completion to make subtle adjustments based on how the structure aged under real use. These follow-up visits were expected, not failures. A beam has darkened where hands touch it most. The carpenter notices immediately. He always does. He rubs the surface thoughtfully, then nods, not to change it, but to accept it. Where here is proof of success. A door creaks faintly now, not badly, just enough to announce itself. The carpenter shifts the hinge with a practiced movement, shaving the smallest amount from a wooden pin. The sound disappears. You wonder how long it would have taken you to notice. A dry, sleepy thought floats through you. Modern buildings squeak because they're lonely. Medieval ones squeak because they're busy. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, slipping in like a shared secret. In some guild traditions, builders believed a house settled into its voice during the first year. Creaks that persisted were addressed. Ones that faded were considered normal, part of the structure learning to speak softly. Historians still debate how much of this language was metaphorical, and how much reflected an intensely practical listening culture among medieval craftspeople. You help with small tasks, tightening, smoothing, adjusting. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would photograph well, but everything feels meaningful. The building responds immediately, like it's relieved to be heard. Outside, the ground near the walls has compressed further. Rain has tested the slopes. Water has moved where it was told to move. The carpenter watches the flow carefully, then smiles faintly. Rare. Earned. As evening comes on, people settle into routines. A stool is moved closer to the fire. Someone leans against a post without thinking. The building accepts it all. You step back again, feeling oddly unnecessary. That's the sign of good work. The structure no longer needs supervision. It has begun its longest task. Living. Time passes. Not dramatically. Not in sweeping montages. Just quietly, the way medieval time always does. Measured in seasons, not seconds. You return again, later still, when the building has endured weather, arguments, laughter, silence. It has changed. Not visibly at first. But when you step inside, you feel it. The space feels confident, settled into its habits, like someone who has learned where everything belongs. Here is your major historical fact for this section, offered like a well-worn truth. Medieval wooden structures survived centuries not because they were static, but because they were designed to be reparable. Parts could be replaced without dismantling the whole. Permanence was modular. A damaged wattle panel has been reworked, not replaced entirely, patched. The carpenter shows you how easily it lifts free. No destruction required, just patience. The repair blends in almost immediately. A modern analogy drifts lazily through your thoughts. Medieval buildings aged like people, not like machines. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, resting lightly on the moment. Some medieval communities marked significant repairs with small, hidden carvings or symbols, dates, initials, or marks only builders would notice. Quiet signatures of care rather than ownership. Historians still debate how common these marks were, especially since many were lost to later renovations or misunderstood as decorative. You trace a line in the wood that wasn't there before. Or maybe it was, and you simply didn't see it. The carpenter shrugs. Wood remembers things differently than people do. The building sounds different now. Not quieter, deeper. Movements inside feel absorbed rather than echoed. The structure has learned its role as a container for life, not just air. Outside, the landscape has adapted too. Paths are clearer. Drainage channels more defined. The building has instructed the land how to behave around it. You realize medieval carpenters didn't just shape structures. They shaped ecosystems. As dusk approaches, light inside the building pools in familiar places. Shadows know where to fall. Everything feels inevitable in the gentlest way. You stand in the doorway once more, noticing how easily it frames the world outside. How natural it feels to pass through it now. The carpenter lingers beside you, silent. There is nothing left to teach today. The building stands behind you, not new, not old, just ready. Eventually, you stop arriving as a builder. You arrive as someone who knows the place. The difference is subtle but unmistakable. You don't scan the structure for problems anymore. Your eyes no longer measure angles or search for stress. Instead, you notice how light behaves on the floor at different hours, how the air cools near the walls first, how footsteps sound softer here than they do outside, even when no one is trying. The building has entered memory. Here is your major historical fact for this section, settled calmly into the moment. Medieval carpenters understood that buildings taught future repairs. The way beams wore, joints loosened, and surfaces smoothed showed where forces truly traveled. Structures became instructional tools for the next generation. You run your hand along a post and feel the polish left by countless palms. This was never part of the plan, and yet it is the most accurate record of use imaginable. No diagram could capture this. A quiet, ironic thought drifts through you. Medieval carpenters didn't need blueprints for the future. The building itself would write them. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, folded into the hush. In some guild traditions, experienced carpenters brought apprentices to older buildings not to repair them, but to listen. The sounds of aged structures were believed to teach restraint better than any lecture. Historians still debate whether this practice was symbolic mentorship or simply a practical way to avoid unnecessary repairs while looking productive. You stand still and listen. The building makes sounds, not alarming ones. Familiar ones, the quiet sigh of cooling wood, the faint creak of a joint shifting as the day releases its warmth. These are not flaws. They are punctuation. Someone nearby moves a stool. The sound is muffled. The floor accepts it without protest. You remember when that same floor was just earth. Outside, the weather turns. Wind moves across the structure, testing it gently the way time always does first. The building answers with calm resistance. It has learned this conversation. You feel something loosen in yourself. The need to intervene, to correct, to improve. Medieval carpenters knew this moment well, the moment when care becomes interference. You step back, letting the structure do what it has been taught to do. Exist. Long after the carpenter is gone, the building remains, not unchanged but recognizable. Seasons pass. Repairs happen. Hands that shaped it are replaced by hands that maintain it, then by hands that simply live within it. Here is your major historical fact for this section, offered like a long-held truth. Many medieval buildings survived precisely because they were never considered finished. Continuous care, small repairs, and adaptive reuse kept them alive while completed structures elsewhere failed. You imagine generations moving through the space, each unaware of most of the decisions that made their comfort possible. They lean against posts. They warm themselves by fires. They sleep beneath beams that were measured with rope and memory. A soft, sleepy joke floats through your thoughts. Medieval carpenters didn't chase immortality. They outsourced it to maintenance. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, drifting like dust in evening light. Some medieval towns believed buildings absorbed the character of those who lived within them. A peaceful household made peaceful walls. A troubled one left marks no repair could fully erase. Historians still debate whether this belief reflects spiritual thinking or simply an early understanding of wear, neglect, and stress. The structure ages gracefully, not without scars, but without resentment. It accepts patches, additions, even mistakes made long after the original builders are forgotten. You walk through it one last time, not as a worker, not as a guest, but as a witness. Every joint you remember still holds. Every compromise still makes sense. The building does not need praise. It has already outlived the moment that created it. And as you step outside, leaving it behind in the quiet confidence of its purpose, you realize the greatest trick medieval carpenters ever mastered was never about tools at all. It was understanding that time is not the enemy. Only impatience is. By the time you return again, you don't announce yourself. You simply arrive. The building has aged just enough to feel unquestionable. No one remembers when it wasn't here. Not clearly, anyway. It has slipped into the background of daily life, which is the highest compliment architecture can receive. Children run past it without looking up. Adults lean against it while talking, trusting it with their weight and their thoughts. This is legacy in its quietest form. Here is your major historical fact for this section. Resting softly like dust on a beam, medieval carpentry techniques endured for centuries because they were self-explanatory to those trained within the tradition. Knowledge was embedded in the structure itself, not written down. The building became the textbook. You walk inside and notice small changes that only time can make. A beam has darkened unevenly where smoke has brushed it for years. A threshold is worn lower at one side, shaped patiently by thousands of feet favoring the same path. These are not flaws. They are signatures. A calm, ironic thought drifts through you. Modern buildings chase timelessness by resisting change. Medieval ones achieved it by allowing it. Here comes the obscure cultural tidbit, slipping gently into the moment. Some medieval carpenters believed that once a building reached a certain age, it no longer belonged to its makers, or even its owners, but to the place itself. Repairs were done with humility, not authority. Historians still debate how widespread this belief was, especially since it left very little physical evidence, only restraint. You notice a repair that wasn't there before. A newer piece of wood, carefully shaped to match the old. It doesn't hide its youth. It doesn't need to. It knows it will age too. The building feels generous now. Forgiving. It has absorbed decades of weather, voices, silence, and small human failures without collapsing into bitterness. You sense that this is not an accident. Outside, the world has changed more dramatically than the structure ever did. Tools evolved. Methods shifted. People began to forget why things were done the way they were done. But the building remembers. You rest your hand against a post. Cool, solid, familiar, and feel a strange comfort in knowing that nothing here was rushed. Nothing here was optimized beyond recognition. The structure has lasted not because it was perfect, but because it was patient. At some point, without ceremony, you stop returning. Not because the building disappears, but because it no longer needs observation. It has crossed the threshold into permanence, that quiet state where something exists so reliably it fades from conscious thought. This is where medieval carpentry always aimed. Here is your final major historical fact, offered softly without emphasis. The survival of medieval wooden buildings into the modern era is not a miracle of strength, but a triumph of understanding materials as living systems, not inert resources. The building continues its work without you. It shelters, creaks. It dries after rain. It warms in sun. It absorbs footsteps, laughter, arguments, and long, wordless evenings. You imagine someone centuries later resting against the same beam you once held steady, unaware of your hands, your breath, your moment of effort. That feels right. A final, gentle irony settles in. Medieval carpenters never built for an audience. Yet here we are, still watching. Here comes the last obscure cultural tidbit, drifting like a closing thought. Some traditions held that when a building finally collapsed, long after its makers were gone, it should be allowed to return to the earth quietly, its materials reused, its shape remembered only in stories. Historians still debate how often this philosophy was practiced, but the sentiment lingers wherever old wood meets soil. And now, slowly, we begin to let go. The building remains behind you, steady and unconcerned. The road stretches ahead, familiar and unremarkable. Your footsteps soften as you walk away, blending into the countless others that came before. Your breathing slows, your thoughts lengthen. The details blur gently, like lamplight through old glass. You don't need to remember every joint, every beam, every clever trick. The structure remembers itself. And as the night settles in, calm, unhurried, unafraid, you're free to rest in the quiet confidence of work well done, of time well understood, of patience rewarded not with applause, but with endurance. So let your shoulders loosen. Let the story fade. The building will still be there in the morning, and you can finally sleep,